What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Sean Jones NBA Show. I'm recording on Monday, October 13th. We are just a little over a week away from the NBA season starting. So I am going to continue my preseason series of doing contender tiers and ranking all 30 NBA teams ahead of the upcoming season. So today we'll be covering two tiers, Tier 7 and Tier 8. I will get into what those tiers are when we get started. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get right into it. So starting with tier number 8, we have two teams, and this tier is called Gap Year. And I think it'll become quickly very apparent which two teams are in this group. But we've got two teams that suffered devastating injuries to their best player during last year's postseason. And so they are just inherently going to look very different from what we're accustomed to seeing out of them. And without their best player on the court for what's likely to be the entire upcoming season, the entire calculus of expectations, roles for the other players on the teams are just completely out of sorts from what we would want from these teams and these players. So without further ado, starting with team number 20, we have the Indiana Pacers. This is the same Pacers team that very, very unexpectedly went on a just completely unprompted run to the NBA Finals last year and made it all the way to a Game 7 against a season-long dominant team in the Oklahoma City Thunder. And if Tyrese Halliburton had not gotten hurt in Game 7, they might have had a really good chance to win the game and be literal NBA champions. But unfortunately, Halliburton did get hurt in that first half when he was playing on a calf strain that probably he would not have been playing if it weren't the NBA Finals. But it's hard to fault him for putting it all out there. I mean, those are the moments that you play your whole career for. But unfortunately, he did suffer a torn Achilles in Game 7, which is going to sideline him for the entire upcoming season. They've already basically said that he's not even going to try to play this upcoming year, and I think that's probably the right call, just given that the injury happened as late in the season as humanly possible, and these things typically take around a year for players to recover from. But aside from not having Halliburton, they also, again, kind of unexpectedly lost Miles Turner in free agency as he signed with the Milwaukee Bucks. Then other than that, they pretty much retained everybody from last year's team. They had Jay Huff from the Grizzlies to be a poor man's Miles Turner of sorts with his floor spacing and a little bit of rim protection he provides. They get Isaiah Jackson and James Wiseman back, both from injury last year as well. And I think the main hope for them is that they get leaps out of some of their younger players with expanded roles, most notably Jarris Walker, Johnny Furphy, Andrew Nembhard, Ben Mathurin, and the bigs I mentioned like Jackson and Wiseman. So again, we need to kind of reframe expectations because if Halliburton was playing, there's no question that the Pacers would be way higher in these rankings. They would be multiple tiers ahead of where they are now. They'd probably be in that group of core Eastern Conference contenders and co-favorites to make the finals because they were just the best team in the East last year. There's really no way around it. They were dominant through the whole postseason. They were one of the best teams in the entire league during the second half of last season. And with Halliburton running the show, there's no real reason to think that they couldn't have replicated that, especially with some of the internal development pieces like I mentioned. But without Halliburton, it changes everything. So to think that they can compete at the same level is just not going to be a realistic expectation. However, I do think this team is going to be annoying to play. I think that they're going to remain a competitive opponent for teams on a nightly basis. I think Rick Carlisle, as one of the best coaches in the NBA, he's proven that over his career, not only with Indiana, but with Dallas previously. And he knows how to get the best out of his guys. He knows how to empower his role players to maximize them. So I think he'll do a lot of that this upcoming season. I think they're going to be really, really solid defensively as well. Because it's funny with Halliburton no longer, in the rotation, he was their weakest link on that end of the court. So they were still a above average, like top 10-ish defense down the stretch of last season with Halliburton. So without him, getting any minutes this season. In theory, they should be even better on that end of the court. Of course, the loss of Miles Turner hurts, but that's mostly as a shot blocker. He's not exactly the most versatile guy on that end of the court. I think it is funny with him. When he came into the league, he was more of a defensive minded player that could show flashes offensively. He's kind of reverted to the opposite now, where he's more of an offensive minded player that can show some defensive flashes with his shot blocking in particular. But if you watch the NBA Finals last year, the Pacers defense was most vulnerable when those Oklahoma City ball handlers were getting Miles Turner into screens and into the action on pick and rolls and having him have to dance a little bit out on the perimeter. So again, not that he's some bad defensive player, but I don't think he is going to be incredibly missed on the defensive end. I think they can kind of makeshift their center rotation on that end of the court at the very least. So between what they've got at the center spot, Pascal Siakam, still very good defender, Andrew Nembhard, Aaron Nesmith, those dudes were just absolutely menaces on defense during last year's postseason run and even the year before that as well. Throw in Ben Mathurin, who's probably going to start. Not exactly a defense first guy, but he still competes hard on that end and is an upgrade over Halliburton. So I think on the defensive end, they're going to be good. They're going to be probably a top half of the league defense. I don't see them being some top 5 defense or anything like that, but that's going to give them a really nice baseline to be a competitive team because we know that they'll play hard. They still have a ton of depth down this roster. I mentioned a lot of the guys they have, but I think the key to how good this team really can be is going to come down to 2 guys, those being Andrew Nembhard and Ben Mathurin, because Siakam, we know what we're going to get at him. He's going to average 20 plus points, 7 to 8 rebounds, 4 to 5 assists in that range, could even get higher than that with increased responsibilities this year as sort of the main guy on offense. But he's going to be rock solid. He's an all-star, borderline all-NBA level guy, but he's probably still going to be a little underqualified to be a full-time number 1. So it's going to take some of these other guys stepping up for them to be able to at least replicate some of what they did offensively last season. And the 2 I mentioned are really the keys here. Andrew Nembhard has strangely just not been nearly as good in the regular season as he has in the postseason. I think at one point in the postseason last year, when he was on a hot streak, was the number 1 player all time in NBA history in terms of 3-point percentage in the postseason. But then he shot around 30% in the regular season last year. So we know he's capable there, but he needs to be more consistent hitting from outside. And I think he will. Is he a 40+% 3-point shooter? In reality, probably not, but he's better than the 30% he displayed. I mean, the guy was hitting crossover step back threes with defenders in his face in the NBA Finals. Like we know he's capable as a shooter, but I also think he can do a lot more as a creator for himself, as a playmaker for others. Like the guy was a point guard in college, actually. He's been forced into sort of this combo off guard role with Indiana just because of how good Halliburton is as the lead guard. But he's more than capable. We saw it in the conference finals a couple of years ago against Boston when Halliburton went down. Nembhard had a couple really big scoring games in a row and just showing that he's capable of an increased offensive load. I do worry a little bit that if he has to take that on a nightly basis, that it could eat into some of his defensive effort. So we'll see. It's just a lot to ask of him to be the main point of attack defender and then also the guy running the show offensively. But I think he's capable of doing both in some spurts or some capacity. And I think he's more than capable of taking on the responsibility offensively. I think he should be viewed as one of the favorites for most improved player this year, just because it's never been about whether he can do those things. He's been a guy that's played within their system, but I think the system's going to shift a little bit. They typically play super high pace, hot, heavy ball movement, get up and run down the court. I kind of think they're going to be a little bit more half court centric this year because I think Nembhard is more of a point guard that operates out of the pick and roll and in more isolation and more of a methodical break the defense down rather than Halliburton, who's just get the ball down the court and find the open man kind of point guard. So I think that also goes hand in hand with Mathurin, who is also more of a half court isolation scorer. So I think their offense is going to look different, obviously, without Halliburton, but I could see them shifting away from the pace a little bit and more towards a half-court centric offense. But look, Ben Mathurin's been a guy that's averaged 17, 18 points a game previously. So would not shock me at all if he averaged 22, 23 points per game or something like that. He's going to have much more opportunity. He's probably going to be asked to be the main perimeter scorer for this team. I wouldn't be surprised if he led the team in scoring, or at least was neck and neck with Siakam. And I think that I've always liked Mathurin, but he's been a little bit of a ball stopper and not always taking the best shots and kind of in his own world sometimes offensively. But I think he's been humbled a little bit as sort of a guy that in the postseason, like, could play 4 minutes or could play 25 minutes. We saw some big performances from him in the finals, so we know what he's capable of, but it's always been about the consistency. So I think having a longer leash this year, plus just having experienced what it's like to not earn minutes, should help him in the long run be a better player. So I do think he's capable. I think him and Nembhard both could take significant, at least statistical leaps. Will it lead to the same level of winning as if they had Halliburton? Probably not. But at least I feel good that they can be a competent team with those guys at the helm. And then, like I mentioned, there's going to be other guys that hopefully step up for them. If Johnny Furphy can prove to be more of a rotation player, Ben Shepherd has had decent spot minutes for them. Same with Jarris Walker. I'm still a big Jarris Walker believer. I think this could be an important year for him to sort of break out into a full-time rotation role for this team, especially with the uncertainty at center, because he's a guy that could potentially play some small ball 5 or at least play the 4 next to Siakam or Toppin at the 5. So we'll see what they get out of them. But I can't sit here after a full season of just praising Halliburton and how good he is and talk about how much of a believer I am in him and rank him in the top 10 when I release my top 100 players in the next week, and talk about just how good and impactful and a winning player he is, and then not act like it's not going to be some massive, massive loss to not have him, because it is. That's just the reality of it. He is the system, the engine that made this team go. And so without him, it's just not realistic to really expect anything significant from this team. I think they'll be frisky. I think they'll be competitive. I think they'll play hard. And I think the loss of Miles Turner compounds it. I think that if they had kept Turner, at least there's more continuity. You have more certainty at the center spot. But they lost 2 starting players now, 2 very important key starting players, and they didn't replace them with really any external replacements there. So with that said, I do think Indiana is going to treat this as a gap year. They got so lucky. During the NBA Finals, they made this trade with New Orleans. They actually owed out their 2026 pick to the Pelicans previously. That was a pick that went out during the Pascal Siakam trade. But they swapped it, where they gave New Orleans their pick in 2025, the draft that just happened, to get back their 2026 pick. Not sure what New Orleans' motivation was there. Maybe they thought the Pacers were going to be super good next year and that they just liked this draft better, so they wanted the pick sooner. But this was before the injury. I'm sure the Pelicans would not have done this had they known Halliburton was going to be out. But again, the timing of this was just incredibly fortunate for Indiana. So now they do have their first round pick for this upcoming year. So I would not be surprised if they hover around 500 for a lot of the season. They're in the play-in discussion, but towards the end of the season, we start to see them, care a little less, because they do have incentive to get a higher draft pick this upcoming year. And if they get lucky and get into that top 3 in a loaded draft that has 3 players in Boozer, Debansa, and Darren Peterson that could realistically be viewed as traditional number 1 picks in a draft, like, that could completely change the course of this franchise. So I think they're better off doing that. They want to be the 8th seed and lose first round. I'm sure they could do that, but I ultimately think, again, it'll be more of a gap year for them, and they'll come back full strength next year. Hopefully Halliburton looks like himself. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time for these guys to get their full legs under them and build up the confidence in their body. But the Pacers still have a bright future. It's just going to be kind of a in-between gap year for them this coming year. Then at number 19, we have the Boston Celtics, who are in an extremely similar boat to Indiana, with Jason Tatum, who very, very unfortunately tore his Achilles in the postseason as well. There have been talks and rumors that he's going to try to play this season. And I won't lie, the videos of him on Twitter right now are ridiculous. And I don't know how he looks so spry and agile and just not injured this early. His injury obviously did occur a little bit earlier than Halliburton's, but not by much. Like Halliburton has completely been ruled out. Tatum, they're saying, could come back. I'm still going to operate under the assumption that he will not play this year. I think that it would be a mistake to rush him back because I don't think Boston will be in a good enough spot for it to be worth it for him to come back. And I just wouldn't risk it. If I was the team, I would just say, hey man, we respect the grind. Like, it's awesome you're putting the work in, but we just would rather reload for the 2026-27 season than risk some re-injury that is just not necessary because the reward just doesn't outweigh the risk. So again, for the purpose of this podcast, I will assume he's not going to play this year, but I mean, we'll see. But outside of Tatum being out, the Celtics made some pretty drastic changes to their roster and rotation this offseason. They were a second apron team that I think there was already rumors that they were going to have to let some guys go to get under the apron to avoid some draft capital penalties down the line. But then when Tatum got hurt, I think they viewed it as an opportunity to say, okay, well, now we're definitely doing this. And, you know, that our fans will not think as much of it because we already weren't going to have our best guy. So it makes sense to kind of reset the cap sheet and go back all in after this coming season. So in the process of that, they traded away Drew Holiday for Anthony Simons. They traded away Porzingis to Atlanta for basically nothing. They let Al Horford and Luke Cornett both walk in free agency. In the process, they add Chris Boucher, Luka Garza, Josh Minot. They draft Hugo Gonzalez. And I think the hope for them is that they're going to get some leaps out of some other young guys. Baylor Shireman, their first-round pick last year, did not play very much. I think he could be a factor in the rotation this year. Neemias Queta got some spot minutes last year, but he's going to be in a much increased role this coming season. Peyton Pritchard was the sixth man of the year last year. It sounds like they're going to give him the opportunity to start and have Simons in more of a bench role, which makes some sense because I think they just want to see what they have with him. And so it will be interesting to see kind of what he looks like in a more elevated role with less of a leash on him. Because, you know, I mean, if we're looking at their finals run from 2024, Pritchard obviously was one of the first guys off the bench, but he did not play well in that postseason, and he had a short leash. You know, if he wasn't making shots, then they were good enough and deep enough where he could play 8 minutes and it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But now, obviously, he's a very key part of this team, and they're going to need him to make shots because they're going to have to make up scoring that Tatum is leaving on the board, but also that Porzingis is leaving on the board, that Drew Holiday is leaving on the board. And so this team, I think as currently constructed, they still have a lot of talent offensively, and I think that they are going to be a nightly threat on that end of the court to put up big numbers because, you know, they still have Jaylen Brown, who's been a 26 to 27 point per game guy at his peak. I expect him to probably be around those same numbers. I am a little bit interested to see what kind of path he takes. Is he just going to be a guy that, okay, I'll add 5 more shots to my shot diet every night and try to score 30 plus, or does he take this upon himself to be more of a distributor and get other players involved a little bit more while not necessarily taking all of the Tatum shots for himself? But either way, they're going to have a consistent 25 point per game score still on the team that they at least can rely on most nights. Derek White has proven to be a guy that can step up and be more of a focal point of the offense in doses. I don't know if he's going to be the guy that now bumps up to 20 points a game or anything like that. I don't really think he's built like that or wired like that. I think he wants to make the right play, shoot when he's open, but get others involved. So I kind of expect him to do the same, but obviously he'll pick up some of the slack there. Peyton Pritchard, like I said, they're going to unleash him. You know, I don't know what his ceiling is as an offensive player, to be honest with you, because he's really only been a spark plug guy, but he's obviously going to score more this season. He's going to shoot more this season. The biggest question is, will the efficiency take a hit because he will be more of a focal point for defenses this year? Then Anthony Simons, as I mentioned, he's been a perennial 20-plus point per game guy. He is a tremendous shooter from outside on high volume, so I think he's going to fit right into the system on that end of the court. And I think as a team, they're just going to shoot a million threes, which will give them a ton of variability on the offensive end. If they're making them, they're going to be really hard to beat, even without Tatum or the other guys that they've lost. But if they're missing them, then it could be a little bit more rough for them because that's just we saw in the postseason when they were full strength and they couldn't hit their shots. They couldn't win some of these games against the Knicks this past year. So for a whole season, I wouldn't be surprised if they broke the 3-point record, but I don't know that is necessarily going to lead to wins all the time. I think it's going to be pretty variable across the board. But I think that I'm more down on the Celtics for this season than a lot of other people. I've seen some people say that they could still make the playoffs as a top 6 seed or at least a play-in team. And I can't rule that out, but this roster feels really incomplete. Like I said, they lose Horford, they lose Cornette, they lose Porzingis, but they didn't add a single starting caliber front court player to the roster. And so they might have the worst big man rotation in the NBA right now. I think the only comparable team is probably the Hornets, who are maybe going to start Mason Plumlee or Ryan Kalkbrenner as a rookie, might throw Diabate in there as well. So regardless, Boston's rotation it's bad. If it's Keita or Boucher or Xavier Tillman, like these are at best 15 to 20 minute per game players. And at worst, they wouldn't. I mean, we just saw last season, Xavier Tillman was not even in the rotation down the stretch of last season. Keita was only a guy playing spot minutes for them. Like Boucher has been buried on Toronto's bench for years now, a team that hasn't even been very competitive. So it's going to be rough. I don't know who's going to rebound the ball for them. I don't know who's going to be a rim protector on this team because they really just don't have one. And so I think defense is going to be a big, big issue for them this year, not only because of the lack of replacement for Porzingis as a shot blocker or Horford and his versatility, what he brought at the center spot. It's not just about that. It's about the fact that Drew Holiday was one of the best point of attack defenders in the NBA, and they replace him with Anthony Simons, who statistically has been maybe a bottom 5 defensive player over the last half decade. Like that is a significant drop off. And we saw what that can look like in Milwaukee when they replaced Drew with Dame and how much of a drop off they took defensively. And Anthony Simons might even be a grander scale of that. Then for all of the stuff Tatum does offensively that they're going to miss, I think his defense is not being talked about enough as a factor for what this team will be lacking next season too, because he was by far their most versatile defensive player. We saw in the NBA Finals in 2024, their counter to Dallas and their big man rotation that had been killing teams all postseason was to put Tatum on the big to start. So that way, when Luka pulled the big out to run a pick and roll, it was Tatum who switched on to Luka instead of a big man. It wasn't Rudy Gobert out there dancing on the line with him. It was Jason Tatum who got switched out onto Luka, which if you were the Mavericks, that's one of the last guys you wanted Luka to be guarded by. So that counter only worked because he also could hold his own guarding the center straight up. Like Lively and Gafford are limited offensive players, but he had the size and strength to hang with them down there. He's also a tremendous rebounder for his position, one of the best at the power forward spot. And so they're going to miss all of the little things that Tatum brought to this team outside of just scoring and shooting. Like I think they can makeshift a lot of what he does as a scorer and shooter. It's going to be more of a by committee approach there, but I don't know if they have the personnel to make up for what he does as a rebounder, as a playmaker at the forward position, as a versatile defender. And so I think the harsh reality of this group is that they're going to be a very bad defensive team, which people don't seem to want to talk about with them. They've been consistently near the top 5 in defense over the past few years, but that's because they had 2 well above average point of attack defending guards in Derek White and Drew Holiday. They had 2 versatile, big, lengthy wing defenders in Tatum and Brown. And then they had a tremendous shot blocking big in Porzingis that could hang on the perimeter a little bit as well. And then Horford came in after him, who miraculously is still incredibly versatile on that end of the court at his age. So they've lost 3 of those guys. Core pieces, probably their 6 best players from the past 2 seasons, no longer on the team, no longer a factor. And it's a lot of points to make up for. It's a lot of defense to make up for. And they just didn't add sufficient replacements for them. And so that's another part of it to me, is that I think if they had intentions of really going for it this season, that they would have added more. Like there's so many other cheap, passable center options they could have added that wouldn't have cost them that much money-wise or, value draft capital on the trade market or anything like that, that they could have at least thrown in there to be a stopgap. But they didn't do that. I really do think they're viewing this as a gap season. Whether Tatum wants to come back or not, we'll see. But they own their pick this upcoming season. So just like Indiana, they are incentivized to, lose a little bit this coming season. So we'll see. I just wouldn't be surprised if by the end of the year, we're seeing Jaylen Brown scratched with an ankle injury every once in a while and stuff like that. And so this roster is just imbalanced. It's subpar defensively from a personnel standpoint. And I don't see why they would want to push their chips into trying to make the postseason this year. So I think this will be a gap season for the Celtics. Again, would I be totally shocked if they were in the play-in conversation? Of course not. But I do think I would take the under on their win total for this upcoming year. And I think that they are okay with that. And I think Celtics fans should be as well. Okay, so we're going to move now to Tier 7. And this tier has 4 teams. It is called Just Frisky or Something More, because that's the question for these 4 teams. We know that they've got some talent. They're on the younger side in general. And we've seen in different capacities these teams look frisky and be able to compete with some of the better teams in the NBA. But they have either not done it consistently, or they're still a little younger. They haven't been able to really get up over the hump into true actual contender status in the postseason. And so the question is, are they just a frisky young team that could maybe sneak into the playoffs, but probably going to lose first round? Or could they be something more? And so starting off at number 18, we have the Portland Trailblazers. And this is a team that has been a bottom feeder in the Western Conference for the past few years since Damian Lillard moved on to Milwaukee. He, ironically enough, is back with Portland, but similarly to Halliburton and Tatum, he's going to be out for this entire season with the torn Achilles as well. So he's really a non-factor for this season. Not going to talk a ton about him. Just going to focus on the players that are going to be playing for them. But they did make a relatively win now move in adding Drew Holiday, swapping him for Anthony Simons, as I mentioned when I talked about the Celtics. They also signed Dame, like I said. They lost DeAndre Ayton. They released him, who, he was not a big factor for them down the stretch last season. And I think that they wanted to see what they have with Klingon. They still have Rob Williams as well. So it makes sense that they moved on from him. Then they draft Young Hansen. But other than that, they really just mostly ran it back. And I get why, because this last year, though the record doesn't look great overall, this team was a winning team and very competitive in the second half of last season. They started the year 13-28 in their first 41 games, but they went 23-18 in the second half. That is 46 win pace, which would have been enough to be in the playoff conversation last season. If you extrapolate that, during that stretch, they had the 10th best net rating in basketball at a plus 3.6, and they were 3rd in defensive rating in the NBA from that point on in the second half with 110 defensive rating. So they were legit. Like, this is a big sample. This is a full half season of them being a just good basketball team, which we have not seen a lot out of them over the past few years play to that level or really even be a competitive team, let alone a team that's winning games. And during this stretch, Ayton only played 10 games. So like I said, he was a non-factor. His removal from this roster might even be an addition by subtraction, because you're opening minutes for Donovan Klingon, who I think has potential to be a really special defensive player and anchor in the paint. Jeremy Grant also only played 17 games. He should be back. We'll see what his role is. He started the preseason game over Denny Avdia, which is just malpractice by Chauncey Billups, in my opinion. Denny Avdia is by far a better player than Jeremy Grant right now on both ends of the court. So I think we could see that change by the end of the year. They might even move Grant at some point. He had some weird comments in the media day saying that he thought he was going to get traded and he didn't. But that's what happens when you sign a bad contract in your early 30s, my guy. It's a little hard to move you. So aside from that, Robert Williams also only played 6 games over that span, so they will have him back. I still think he's a really good player when he plays. I know that's always been the caveat with him, and you can't really bank on him being a factor because of his health, but having him back, I think, as a backup where you're not relying on him to be the main guy is a good spot for him. But this team just goes 9 deep with really solid, good rotation pieces that play hard on both ends. in the backcourt with Scoot, who actually is going to be injured to start the season, which is a bit of a bummer because I was thinking that he could be due for a breakout year, but which it still could happen, but it's always a little harder when you're coming back mid-season into the year. But him now with Drew Holiday in that backcourt, along with Shaedon Sharpe, who's been a reliable scoring option for them, mostly off the bench. Denny Avdia, as I mentioned, who had a really nice breakout season last year. He's a two-way guy. He can create offensively. It really expanded his game as a playmaker last season and more of a go-to scorer. So I'm super high on him. He's still surprisingly young, too, 24 years old. So I think they should lean into him as sort of a do-it-all point forward of sorts at times. Then you've got Jeremy Grant, as I mentioned. They still have Matisse Thybulle off the bench. Then Toumani Camara, the hidden gem of the Damian Lillard trade, and looked like a throw-in. He was the 52nd overall pick by the Suns back in the draft right before that trade was made. He gets sent over to Portland, and he's the best thing they got back from that deal. And as far as players go, he was an all-defensive player last year, shot above 40% from three in the second half of the season. Looks like just the ideal 3-and-D wing. I don't know how much he'll be able to contribute offensively outside of just being a spot-up shooter and an athlete attacking the basket off cuts and in transition. But hey, if that's all he is, he's still a damn good player, and I think he's got an opportunity to cement himself as one of the premier defensive wings in the league with his length. And then, like I said, clinging down low, Robert Williams, that's a really, really good defensive pairing in the paint. And so do they have the go-to guy? No. I think this roster really has everything else you could want except for the guy offensively. I think that they're going to be really, really tough and solid defensively like they were last year. They actually remind me a little bit of the Magic from a few years ago. In Paolo Banchero's rookie season, they weren't very good, and they were just awful in the first half, but they had a really, really strong second half that was headlined by a really, really strong defensive performance in the second half, very similar to what Portland did last year. And so I think that they could make a similar leap. You know, Orlando the next year ends up winning 47 games. They're a top 5 seed. I'm not saying Portland's going to do that, but I just think that there's a proof of concept of building off a strong finish to the season like that, especially when the sample was so big. It wasn't like the last 15 games of the year where players are in and out of the lineup and there's a lot of jockeying for seeding going on. It was a whole half season. This started back in January. So the sample is big enough for me to think that it's replicable, especially when you consider that they add Drew Holiday, who should be a upgrade over Simons, especially defensively, but also as a decision maker and more of a ball handler offensively rather than just a scorer and shooter. When you look at Denny Avdia, who will continue to get better, Kamara, I already mentioned, Klingon, all these guys are just, they project to get better from last season. And I think the ceiling for this team ultimately comes down to Scoot Henderson, who, like I said, will miss the start of the year, but it doesn't seem like a serious injury. And so he was awful his rookie season, like very, very bad. It was a disaster, without a doubt. Very disappointing considering how high people were on him. But last year, he really started to figure things out in the second half. The jump shot was becoming more reliable. The decision-making was improving. He was finishing at the basket a little bit better, and at least showing semblance of a good starting point guard in the NBA. And I still remain high on Scoot. I think he's got the DNA of a guy that plays super hard on both ends, that is generally a good feel for the game on offense as a passer and initiator. It's really going to come down to the efficiency and the shot. I don't know what his ceiling is going to end up being there, but I will say this. He's in a really good environment to make whatever leap he's going to make. He's got Chauncey Billups, who's a Hall of Fame point guard, NBA champion, finals MVP as his head coach. He's got Drew Holiday, who will be playing next to him, who, again, a championship player on 2 different franchises, a guy that's just been one of the most respected backcourt players in the NBA for a decade now. And then he's got Damian Lillard on the end of the bench recovering as well. So the franchise legend, a top 75 NBA player all time, a first ballot Hall of Famer, no question. So he's got all of the guys around him that he could need to coach him into being the point guard of this team's future. So If he doesn't figure it out over the next few years, it's fair to question if he ever will. And so that's going to be big. I do think offense is going to be a problem for this team a lot. The second half stretch I mentioned, they still were only 20th offensively. So they are a bit offensively challenged. They don't have the most shooting. They lose a lot of shooting and scoring with Simons as well in place of more defense with Holiday. So we will see. But I think Shaedon Sharpe and Scoot Henderson are going to need to be the two guys that step up offensively and provide some level of consistency as scorers. And if they don't, like I said, it could be kind of rough, especially in the half court. But defense wins in this league. I'm going to bank on this being a team that could be in the top 5 defensively this upcoming season. To the original question, I do think they probably are just more frisky than anything right now. I do think they can and probably will make the play-in in the West, which is a big accomplishment given how stacked the West is. And for a team that's, only a couple years into this rebuild, they are far ahead of schedule compared to a lot of their counterparts that have been rebuilding for half a decade, if not longer. So they've made a lot of good moves. They have a lot of good players. And I think them taking a leap into the plan would be a really nice next step. I mean, they won 34 games last year. If they can bump that up to 5 to 7 more wins from last season, which I don't see why they couldn't, that'll put them around 500, and that should be good enough to at least have them in the conversation for that 10 seed. So overall, just frisky, but I do think Portland's going to be better than people think they will be, and they'll be one of the more surprising teams for at least a portion of this upcoming season. Then up next at number 17, we have the Memphis Grizzlies, who are going to look a little bit different than they have over the last few seasons. They've had this general core of Jaren Jackson Jr., John Morant, and Desmond Bane, which has led them to be a perennial playoff team when they've been healthy with that group, but that has been a big if for them. But this season, they actually move off of Desmond Bane in a deal that netted them a haul of draft picks, but clearly signaling that they were willing to maybe take a step back before they eventually take a step forward. They now obviously have a ton of draft capital to make another move or use a lot of those picks if they end up wanting to rebuild down the road. It gives them options. So in return for Bane, outside of the picks, the main headliner there was getting Kentavious Caldwell-Pope back, who did not have a very good year for Orlando last year, but obviously still useful, good 3-and-D guard, in my opinion. I think that the shooting will regress back to the norm, which was at least league average for him, even though it wasn't great last year. But we'll see. They also add Ty Jerome to their backcourt, Jock Landale to help their front court. They lose Luke Kennard in free agency to Atlanta, and they trade Jay Huff away to the Pacers. And then they traded up in the draft to take Cedric Coward in the lottery. A bit of an unknown as a prospect. He just didn't play that much. He played 6 games last season due to injury and has never really played against high-level competition in college. So the skill set, the talent, all of it looks to be there on paper. The numbers back up that he was a highly productive and efficient college player. But until we see it against the highest level competition, there's reason to be a little bit skeptical there. But last season was a roller coaster, to say the least. They start the year 35-16 before limping to the playoffs. They finish the year 13-19. They end up firing Taylor Jenkins with just like a week to go left in the season, right before the postseason. They completely fell apart defensively down the stretch. They battled injuries all year long. John Morant did not manage to play more than 5 consecutive games at any point during the season, was just in and out of the lineup despite nothing serious throughout the year, but he just has not been reliable. And the problem for them is that those injuries are still there now, even just going into this year. John Morant sprained his ankle in training camp and is listed as week to week, so it's unclear whether he will be ready for the start of the season. Jaren Jackson Jr. had foot surgery in the offseason after signing his max extension. It's unclear when he will be back, probably out to start the year. Brandon Clark also had knee surgery. He will be out to start the season, but should be back at some point. Zach Edey also had surgery on his ankle, should be out to start the season, but back at some point. And so that's a lot of key players, especially in the front court. That's their starting center, the starting power forward, probably their top backup big, and then John Morant, their best player. So it's already not looking super promising for them to go into the year. If all these guys are hurt, then it's going to be an uphill battle, especially without Bane. I think what Desmond Bane did for this team was so just underrated. I think he's a really good player, but he was just so seamlessly able to wear multiple hats. When they were full strength, he had no problem being the complementary, really third option at times offensively, and focus more on just being a spot up shooter and competing defensively. But when their guys were out, he really stepped up to take a lot of the responsibilities of ball handling, playmaking, initiating on offense, shot creation, all while still being a great spacer and shooter for them offensively. And so I think they're going to miss that. No Ja Morant, if he misses some time at any point, which, by the way, like I said, he's already banged up to start the year, but he played only 50 games last year, 9 the year before that, 61 the year before that, 57, 63, 67. He's hit the 65 game mark 0 times since his rookie season, has never hit the 70 game mark, and has been under 60 in 3 of the last 4 years. So I think it's very fair to question the reliability of him. And if he's going to miss time, you don't have Bane anymore. I'm not sure where the shot creation is going to come for this team, because I know Jaren Jackson has made some strides there, but I personally don't really trust him on that front still. I still think he's probably an underqualified second option, if we're being honest. He's a guy that kind of relies on other players to get him the ball in his spots. He is an overrated three-point shooter. His career percentage is in the 34 to 35%, which is below league average, despite being advertised as his big floor spacer. I think he's incredibly impactful as a defender, but I'm really just talking about the offensive end here, because that's where I could see this team kind of struggling. They do have depth, so I will give them that. Their core of Morant and Jackson as the top 2 guys, but then KCP, Ty Jerome, Scottie Pippen Jr. It's a very solid guard rotation around those guys. Cedric Howard, a little bit of an unknown, like I mentioned, but has the skill set to be good in the NBA if it all clicks. Jalen Wells, who got hurt at the end of last year, was a really surprisingly good rookie for them last year. Should, again, be a solid 3-and-D guy for them. Vince Williams has shown flashes of that as well. Brandon Clark, Zach Edey, Gigi Jackson, Jock Landale, and then Sandy Aldama. I think Aldama is probably going to be a very big focal point for this team early on, especially in the absence of Jackson. And I believe he's a restricted free agent after this year, so we'll see if he kind of plays himself out of Memphis with getting a bigger deal in free agency. But regardless, they have a lot of guys, but I don't know if I really know who's fitting what role, and I don't know if any of these guys are qualified enough to take on an increased role if Ja and Jackson are missing time. And they have both consistently missed time in their careers, especially Ja as of late. And so I just get worried that, like, if Ja plays 60 games, 55 games, so that's 25, 30 games right there where they're not going to have their 25 point per game score, and they don't have Desmond Bane to fall back on. What if Jackson misses some of those games? So I just get a little concerned about where the offense is going to come from in the games Ja does not play. But I will give it to them. When Ja plays, this team wins games. So I do think, like I said, they're at the very minimum, they're a frisky team. Like, if, let's say, Ja plays 70 games this upcoming season, Jaren Jackson comes back and is healthy the whole year, could they win 50 games and be the 5 seed? They totally could. I'm not putting that past them. We've seen the proof of concept for this group to be able to do that. But I just remain skeptical because their top guys are a little unreliable health-wise, and they removed a really, really important player without replacing him to the same level. So I like a lot of their pieces, but I just think they took a clear step back talent-wise from what we've seen in the past. And so to me, they ultimately are just more frisky than something more. But a lot of that is driven by health. So if they have a fully healthy season once all these guys come back, then I have no doubts that they could win around 50 games and be a competitive playoff team as well. Next, at number 16, we have the Detroit Pistons, which might seem a little lower than some other people would be ranking them across the league, but they did have a little bit of some shakeup around the roster. They lose Dennis Schroeder in free agency to Sacramento. They lose Malik Beasley, who, again, not really their fault. He had some off-the-court issues of gambling accusations that they had to get sorted out. I'm sure he would have been back. There was rumors that they already had an extension lined up. So that was unfortunate for them, but he is going to be quite a big loss for them from last year. They lose Tim Hardaway Jr. in free agency. They trade away Simone Fontecchio. In return, they get Duncan Robinson in that deal, who should be able to replicate at least some of the shooting that they lose. And then they signed Karis LeVert to be a key bench piece as well. And so last year, the Pistons were quite a surprise. They were coming off one of the more disappointing and just pathetic seasons in a long time, signing Monty Williams. The hope was that Cade was going to be able to take a leap. Well, they set the NBA record for most consecutive losses in a season. They didn't even get to 15 wins, and they had just been pretty much a dumpster fire over the last few seasons. And then last year, they start 9-15. They're still hovering around 500 through the midway point of the season. They were 25-26. But then they have a 17-6 stretch from early February to late March and end up winning 44 games en route to the number 6 seed, avoiding the play-in altogether. So this was a just tremendously successful season for Detroit, unlike anything we've seen from them or this core over the last few years. One of the bigger leaps from just a sheer increased win total amount that we've seen in a long time as well. And going into next year, like I said, they shook it up a little bit with some of their veterans, but they're really going to be relying on their internal young core to develop for them to continue to improve, which predominantly that is Cade Cunningham, Jaden Ivey, Asar Thompson, and Jalen Duren as their top 4 guys. They still have Tobias Harris, Isaiah Stewart, Ron Holland, mentioned the additions of LeVert and Duncan Robinson. So a lot of makeshift pieces around their core guys. And in my opinion, they've kind of reached this fork in the road. I know they've only been like good or competitive for 1 year, but we see this a lot when these teams sort of come out of nowhere and are much better than expected. I think a lot of people think that the way development works is linear, where you're a bottom feeder, then you're flirting with the play-in, then you're a playoff team, then you are a contender. But it often doesn't work like that. They skipped the step of like a play-in team. They went straight from bottom feeder up to a solid playoff team. But that also means that it can go one of two ways from here. Some teams continue to ascend and become more legitimate contenders as time goes on. Other teams regress a little bit, and we don't see the same replicated performance and production that we saw from the year before. I mean, we can just look at a handful of examples. So in terms of teams that have taken that next step after a bit of a breakout, the Wolves with Anthony Edwards, they were an 8 seed, then they were the 7 seed the next year, then they ascend all the way up to the number 3 seed. Then last year they fall back to the 6 seed, but they still make the conference finals. So we can see it was a linear progression of them getting better and better and being more legitimate as time went on. Another great example is the Pacers. You know, they showed some promise in Halliburton's first full season there, but he got hurt. They kind of fell apart. They end up falling out of contention. Then is the next year, they're the 6th seed. They get lucky with some injuries, but find themselves in the conference finals. And then last year, they were even better in the regular season. They were a top 4 seed, and then they make it all the way to the NBA finals. And then, of course, the Thunder are a prime example of this, going from deep in the lottery to 500 play-in team to a 1 seed that couldn't get over the hump to NBA champions. So that's kind of like the blueprint right there. But then we see teams that go on the other side as well. If you look at the Kings with De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis, they unexpectedly win 48 games. They're a top 3 seed, but they just weren't able to replicate it. They missed the playoffs the next year. Then within a year from that, they end up trading away De'Aaron Fox, and now they have a very bleak future to build around. Paolo Banchero, Franz Wagner, and the Orlando Magic. They go from a frisky team that, you know, played well down the stretch of the second half to a 47-win team and a top 5 seed in the East. But then last year, they suffer a lot of injuries, and the shooting and offensive clunkiness that they've had is really put under a microscope. They end up falling back a little bit, only win 41 games right at 500 and are in the play-in last year. Then we look at the Pelicans 2 years ago, 49 wins. Zion Williamson is playing the game of his life in the play-in. He goes down. They end up losing first round. Last year, they had some unlucky injuries, and they are a bottom feeder in the Western Conference after looking like a team that could be ascending. Then, I mean, it goes on. The 2021 Hawks that are in the Eastern Conference Finals, they have not been able to replicate even just being a playoff team outright out of the play-in since then. The Chicago Bulls in their first year with Levine and Vucevic and DeRozan and Lonzo Ball. They're a 46-win team near the top of the standings, have some injuries, fall back a little bit, but since then they have been the poster boy for mediocrity and the play-in. So I say all that to say that it can go one of two ways. They could continue to ascend into this contender in the Eastern Conference, but there are a ton of examples as well of these teams overperforming with less and then not being able to replicate it the next season. And so I think most people think they fall into the first category there, but I'm a little less sure of it. I am kind of in the regression boat for Detroit this upcoming season for a number of reasons. I think one, they on paper kind of did get worse in my opinion. I think that one of the big reasons they were so good last year was because they finally got a lot of shooting around Cade Cunningham, which we had kind of been desperately asking them to do. But between losing Tim Hardaway Jr. and Malik Beasley, that is 487 made three-pointers from last season that will not be on the roster this year. Duncan Robinson is a great shooter, but he's not quite the same movement shooter as Duncan Robinson. He doesn't have quite the off-the-dribble ability that Malik Beasley has, and I just don't think he's going to get the same volume up that Beasley did. And Beasley was just, I cannot overstate how important he was. Is he a better player than like Duren or Tobias Harris, for example, overall? Probably not. But last year, there's a real argument to be made that he was their second best player, that he was their most important player outside of Cade Cunningham. So that loss is significant. And I think Duncan Robinson's maybe the best they could have done to try to replace him. But again, I just don't think he's the same sort of spark plug scorer that Beasley is. He's a little bit more limited there. And he's going to rely on others to get himself open a little bit more. Then Karis LeVert, I just don't love that fit. He's at his best with the ball in his hands, but he's not a true lead guard or anything like that. He's not a very good spot-up shooter. I just don't think that is my favorite fit for this team. It's essentially the kind of player they had previously tried to pair with Cade that did not work so well. They also lose Dennis Schroeder, who also not a fantastic shooter, but another guy that they trusted with the ball in his hands, which they did not have a lot of last year. It was a lot of Cade doing everything and having to get everybody involved. And Schroeder took a lot of the pressure off of him. And so they don't have a guy like that this year. You could argue Jaden Ivey coming back as that guy, but I still think that's another reason why there might be regression. Not that Ivey's going to hurt the team, but the fit is a little up in the air still. You know, he hasn't been a consistent shooter throughout his career. He showed some flashes of finally figuring it out last year, but the sample was small. And I don't know what his ideal role for this team is. I still think he's a guy that's best with the ball in his hands. So is Cade. And so I don't know if they'll get the best, most maximized version of Jaden Ivey next to Cade Cunningham and vice versa because of just their playing styles and what works best there. They also were incredibly healthy last year outside of Jaden Ivey. Cade Cunningham, Tobias Harris, Jalen Duren, Tim Hardaway Jr., Malik Beasley, Isaiah Stewart, Ron Holland, Simone Fontecchio, and Dennis Schroeder. That is 9 players that all played 70 or more games. This was a huge factor of the Kings being really good a few years back. Their entire starting lineup was incredibly healthy the whole year. And so we've seen regrets. I don't think all 9 of those guys, even though some aren't on the team anymore, their replacements are not going to all play 70-plus games. I just think that the way the NBA is today, injury luck strikes at some point, but you're going to have guys miss games. And so I worry that, again, if some of those guys miss more time, then the talent on the roster is even thinner than it is compared to last year already. I also think Cade, despite being a very, very good player, still has more to prove. He's only had one season with even league average efficiency on a competitive team, which of course I expect him to still be really good. And I'm not saying he's going to like regress or anything like that. I'm just saying that I think people are ready to anoint him as this sort of top 15 guy. And I don't know if I'm there yet on it. I think he's a top 30 player, could be borderline top 25, but he was terrible in the playoffs last year. He averaged over 5 turnovers a game. He shot 5 for 28 from 3. That's 18%. And he had a 50.9 true shooting percentage. Like when the games got tight and the stakes got higher, he did not play well. He did not have a good playoffs. And so I want to see a little bit more from him. I want to see if he really can elevate the new, slightly revamped roster they have. I want to see if they can stay healthy. I want to see how Jaden Ivey gets integrated. And so I'm not saying the Pistons are going to stink or be some bad team, but I'm not ready to push them up into the next tier from what they were last year. I think last year I'd classify them as frisky, not something more. And so this year, I still think they're probably only just like a frisky young team that plays hard on defense and wants to get into it with you. But I still have questions about the offense outside of Cade. I have questions about the shooting. I have questions about the talent overall on the offensive end. Even a guy like Jalen Duren, Asar Thompson, great athletes, good defensive players, especially in Asar Thompson's case. But what do they bring offensively? Duren is just really nothing more than a rim runner and a role player, which there's a place for that. But this team might need more out of some guys than just that. Asar Thompson, I still am extremely concerned about what he is going to turn into on the offensive end. He still does not have a semblance of a jump shot. He's not much of a creator. He's just a raw athlete on that end of the court. And I think his contributions defensively are great. But I just want to see one more year of them proving that last year wasn't a fluke before I'll be fully bought in, and then we'll go from there. But so I would not be surprised if the Pistons regress a little bit and are really nothing more than just a frisky team again. And then the last team in tier 7, just frisky or something more, is the San Antonio Spurs, who made a big midseason acquisition last year, acquiring De'Aaron Fox. Unfortunately, him and Wembanyama only had a few games together. I think they played around 120 minutes total together before Wemby went down with the blood clot issue last season, so his season was cut short. They were pretty much out of contention at that point. They didn't play particularly well post-trade anyway, so I don't think it's a big deal, but you obviously want those guys to get reps. But then they get lucky in the draft, end up with the number 2 pick, draft Dylan Harper, who plays the same position as De'Aaron Fox. But I applaud them for just taking the best talent and not going fit there. I think that was the correct move. You'll figure it out down the line. They also get Carter Bryant at the back end of the lottery, a guy I like as well. They lose Chris Paul in free agency. They add Kelly Olynyk, Luke Cornett, and of course they get both Fox and Wembanyama back healthy together, though Fox is going to miss potentially the start of the season due to a hamstring injury, but it's not anything that should be serious. So, and I'll say this about the Spurs. I still feel like this front office has not done a very good job of surrounding Wemby with the right fits for what this team needs, with support in terms of offensive creation, in terms of just straight up shooting. It's a lot of clunky fits. They've got some talent, but I don't love how everything fits together. To start out, they have really no spacing whatsoever. They have 3 guards in their backcourt that are all a little redundant in Fox, Castle, and Harper, none of which can shoot particularly well. Harper still obviously up in the air. He was inconsistent in college, but could knock it down a little bit. But De'Aaron Fox shot only 31% from 3 last year, only 33% for his career. I think it's just safe to say at this point in his career that he's just not a very good 3-point shooter. He can make them on volume, but he's just never going to be an above average 3-point shooter. Then Stephon Castle, a guy a lot of people like. I like him to an extent, but his jump shot's just broken. He shot sub 30% from 3 in college. He was 28.5% as a rookie. He just can't shoot the ball. And I don't really know what position he is either, because they keep talking about they want him to be more of a point guard. I don't really see him as a point guard. I think he's ultimately best suited as a wing that can do a little bit of playmaking for others, but it's going to be really hard for him to play that if he can't shoot. I mean, shooting 33, 34% is a lot different from shooting 27, 28. 27, 28, people are not going to guard you at all. So the guard support around Wemby, just really no spacing at all. And that doesn't even take into account Jeremy Sohan, who is not only a bad shooter, but really just a zero offensively altogether. Keldon Johnson, who can score a little bit, but again, below average shooter, not the most efficient player. I do like Devin Vassell, but with the imbalance on this roster, they have so many guards that Vassell's probably best suited as a 2 guard, but he's going to be forced to play small forward because they don't really have any other small forwards on the roster, and you want to get him in the lineup with 2 of those guards. So he's going to have to slot down a position, which is obviously not ideal. And if you look at just the wing spot on this roster, they don't have much. Harrison Barnes is pretty much just a filler at this point. Champagne's still a little undersized. They do draft Carter Bryant, who I like a lot. I think he's the exact kind of player they need. He can shoot. He is long and a good defender, especially as a playmaker, weak side shot blocker, just active on that end of the court. But he's really young. I mean, he was a role player in college and only played one season. So I don't anticipate him having some large role as a rookie. I think it's going to take a couple years, but I at least do like the pick there. But for the purpose of this exercise, it's about this season. And I don't know if he's going to be ready to contribute at the level he needs. And so I say all this to say, all very negative talk on the Spurs. I'm more just talking from the perspective of I feel like this roster is still pretty incomplete and they could do a lot better to set Wembanyama up to succeed. However, I still do think the Spurs can be really good this season, but it really has everything to do with Victor Wembanyama. I am just blindly betting on him thrusting himself into the legitimate MVP candidate territory. And with that would take him having to win, around 45-ish games and firmly be in the playoff conversation, which I think he can be good enough to do. And I say that because if you just look at superstars in the NBA today, year 3 is right about where usually they end up pushing their team into a place where they're legitimately contending for a playoff spot, and the stats and talent start to actually add to wins in the win column. If you just go down the list, just a couple guys to name a few. Luka Doncic, by year 2, his team was at 48 win pace, if not for the shortened season, and was a top 5 seed in the playoffs. Anthony Edwards in year 2 was a 46 win team and in the playoffs. Paolo Banchero, even a younger guy, by year 2, his team was 47 wins and a 5 seed. Nikola Jokic, year 3, 46 wins. They did miss the playoffs, but they only lost it on a tiebreaker, and 46 wins is good to get you in most years. LeBron James, year 2 was in the playoffs. Year 3 was 50 wins and a top 4 seed. KD, year 3 was 50 wins and a playoff team. Giannis, by year 2, was in the playoffs. Halliburton, by year 4, which he's a little bit of a weird one because he got traded. So really his 3rd season with Indiana, which kind of still fits this. 47 wins, made the Eastern Conference Finals. Anthony Davis, year 3, 45 wins and in the playoffs. Tatum, by year 1, was a 2 seed and an Eastern Conference Finals team, but he was on a little bit of a stacked team, so a little unfair there. SGA, year 1, 48 wins in the playoffs. Year 2, 50 win pace and a 5 seed in the West. Joel Embiid, year 2, 52 wins and a 3 seed. Steph Curry was really the only one who had to go to year 4, in which he won 47 games and was a 6 seed. But his year 3, he only played 26 games, so it's a little unfair. But the point is, look at all these guys. If you are that level of player, you're a bona fide top 10 guy, you're in the MVP conversations, perennial All-NBA guy, by year 3, you typically are making that leap to the playoffs. I think that highly of Wembanyama. I think he would have been an All-NBA player last year had he not gotten hurt. I think he would have won Defensive Player of the Year had he not gotten hurt. I think he's a shoo-in for all of the accolades this year. Defensive Player of the Year, All-NBA, All-Star, assuming he plays the requisite number of games. And again, I think he could finish top 5 in MVP. And so I am taking a blind leap of faith to say that I think the Spurs will be a team that is firmly in the playoffs next year, and I think it's because of Wembanyama, and if not for much else. And look, their roster's not terrible. They have talent. De'Aaron Fox has been an all-star. He's a 25-point-per-game scorer when he's on, and he is a good player. I still think he's going to take a ton of pressure off Wemby. I've never been like the biggest De'Aaron Fox guy because he can't really shoot, because he's a little bit tunnel vision-y sometimes, but just having another offensive weapon, another creator, a ball handler that can run the pick and roll with Wemby, like all of that is going to take so much pressure off him. The sample size was too small last year. I wouldn't judge too much they have a full training camp together this time. And I do like some of the role players like Vassell, like I mentioned. Carter Bryant, I think, could turn into something. They finally added some competent backup bigs around Wemby with Cornette and Olynyk, who have both been good professional, rotation bigs in their career. And so there is some supporting cast there. I just don't love the fit with a lot of it, but I just think he's too good. I think he's going to figure it out. And I think he's going to put pressure on this front office, because I think that they're going to see, oh shit, like we could actually win something a lot sooner than maybe we think we can. And I think they're also going to see a lot of the flaws of the rest of this roster come out, particularly when they do get to the postseason. So they need to figure out who is going to be the lead guard for this team long-term, whether it be Fox or Harper, or whether those guys can coexist. They need to figure out if there's a big fish they're going to make a trade for, like a Giannis or someone else, who's expendable and who's not, who's a keeper, who's not. And they need to eventually add more shooting, more wing reinforcements for the team. But for this year, I think Wembanyama is good enough to basically do it on his own, but he's going to have to stay healthy, and he's going to need to click with De'Aaron Fox on the offensive end. So I think they're a little bit more than Frisky. I do think they could be something more. I wouldn't be shocked if they were a top 6 seed, even with how loaded the West is, just because I think it's about that time for Wembanyama to take that leap into true stardom. Even though people have been wanting to anoint him all the way up there, his offensive game has still been relatively inefficient to start his career. But I think he can take a mini leap there and get to a point where we're like, okay, this guy's one of the 10 best players in the world. And that's going to do it for this episode of the Sean Jones NBA Show. The season is just about a week away, so I do intend to have the final 3 episodes with the remaining 6 tiers come out before the season starts. So keep the lookout for those over the next week. We are starting to finally get into the actual legitimate playoff teams in the next episode. So excited to talk through those with you guys. I also will have my annual top 100 player rankings come out very soon before the season starts as well. So keep an eye out for those on my social medias. But with that said, thank you so much for listening, and I will chat with you soon.